Mike Bloomberg has formally announced today he is running for president. Now, it was obnoxious to me that for these past couple weeks, the media had to pretend that they didn't know whether he was really running for president, even though he did several things which should have been the ultimate tip off that he was running for president, such as filing formally with the FEC and establishing his campaign committee, such as getting himself on the ballot in several primary states, and such as making an enormous ad buy, the largest in American history, for campaign commercials that are airing across the entire country, not just in early primary states. Apparently, he is foregoing the 4 early primary states and flooding all the top media markets like New York, Los Angeles, etc., with TV commercials. And you can now go watch those commercials where he goes through his biography as though it's this inspiring story of a selfless political hero. So that was annoying to me. And the coverage of Bloomberg as a presidential campaign should have began before today, but today it begins. And I have a couple thoughts here, some of which stem from my own personal experience, because as I tweeted yesterday, I experienced directly one of Bloomberg's signature acts, which to me 100% solidified my perception of him as a brazen authoritarian. And that was the raid on the Occupy Wall Street encampment, the original one in Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan in November 2011. I was there when that raid was ordered in the middle of the night by Bloomberg to clear out the encampment, which meant to crush it and to essentially crush the Occupy Wall Street movement. That was Mike Bloomberg's direct order, which resulted in that. And guess what? He violated a court order which had been issued that very day, which said that Zuccotti Park must be open to the public. Bloomberg said, you know what? Screw that. I'm shutting it down. And I'm going to launch this quasi-paramilitary raid, which shut down all the surrounding streets and basically just enlisted the NYPD into doing his personal bidding in contravention of the law. If you were there, or even if you watched on live stream, because that was around the time when live streaming live events really became popular, you could kind of witness it without being physically present. You remember how unbelievable that was. I mean, I would watch NYPD taking the license that they were granted by Mike Bloomberg and just beating people up, throwing people around. And you knew that you could really never combat it. You knew that filing a complaint was not going to result in anything. But this police raid was not something that you would expect a municipal police force to ever have within their capacity. It was done as if it was a military squad. And sure enough, Mike Bloomberg, during that time period, had really gotten to the height of his power trip and was running around telling audiences that he commands a military, that he has his own personal military. He was proud of it. He was boastful about it. And of course, he was referring to the NYPD, which under his rule had ceased to perform the functions strictly of a police force and had become this quasi-military force. Bloomberg presided over one of the most blatant militarizations of any peacetime police force that had really ever occurred, probably in the history of the world. And that might sound like a bit of an exaggeration, but the NYPD is by far the largest police force in the country. The United States is the most powerful country in the world, so you can make a pretty straightforward deduction there as to what that militarization process entailed, or what the magnitude of it was. And it was an enormous magnitude. And not every police force around the country handled their respective Occupy encampments in the same way. I mean, if you remember, Occupy spread all across the country and even to some extent the world. And eventually, many of those Occupy encampments kind of just dissipated on their own. Obviously, there were other problems with police regulation in other places, but Bloomberg made it a point to do this spectacular raid in the middle of the night where at one moment the Occupy encampment was ongoing. People had a legal right to be there. Whatever you might think about the purposes of that movement or whatever criticisms you might have is immaterial. One moment the encampment was underway and people were exercising their constitutional rights. The next moment, the entire thing was just cleared. It was like it never happened. It was eerie and it was disturbing. And the NYPD, I can still vividly recall, and I wrote about it at the time. Maybe I'll go resurrect some of those pieces. I actually reviewed a little bit of it yesterday. The NYPD would do stuff by just like closing down arbitrarily certain sidewalks and telling people that you were impeding pedestrian traffic. They told me I was impeding pedestrian traffic as they were blocking pedestrian traffic themselves by just kind of walking in a line and moving people off the sidewalk. So they would tell you you're impeding pedestrian traffic when we were the pedestrians and they were the ones who were impeding the traffic because that's what their orders were. It was mind-boggling to witness because it showed to you in a direct, visceral way that when state power wants to deploy itself, they can justify their actions on the basis of anything. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be coherent. The order's given, and then they're going to do what they are told to do, and they don't have to provide you with a logic behind it. They don't have to make an argument for why it follows any kind of coherent argument that justifies what they're doing. They're doing it because it's self-justifying. It was handed down as an order by the top, Mike Bloomberg, and that was it. And so from then on, when I saw Bloomberg, finally relinquish his office, obviously all that occurred during Bloomberg's third term, which he cajoled out of the New York City Council, even though New York City voters had twice voted to impose term limits. It's funny because we're told now that Evo Morales in Bolivia was this brutal authoritarian because he opted to run for an additional term this election cycle. And that was supposed to be because he was power hungry. Maybe he was power hungry to some extent. Maybe it would have been preferable for him to designate a successor rather than run himself. But he was given license to seek that additional term by the supreme judicial body in his country. Mike Bloomberg decided to basically twist the arms of the city council and use his enormous financial weight to enlist some of the major media entities in New York City, like the New York Daily News, which is under different ownership now, like I just read an article about this, but I don't want to misspeak. But I know for sure the New York Daily News was enlisted in supporting his third term, which he got in 2009. And so therefore, he was the one in power during this Occupy raid. And guess what also happened during that raid? Journalists were arrested, including ones associated with the Associated Press, the New York Times. So not just freelance live streamers or guys who could be accused of not being traditional journalists or having traditional credentials. No, he arrested true journalists. I shouldn't say the word true. He arrested journalists who satisfied all the typical criteria for credentialization. And so when you're there and you see that all happen firsthand, and you're not just hearing about it through journalistic accounts or whatever, that stays with you, or at least it stayed with me. And then for him to transition after he finally relinquished power in 2014 and go into like liberal philanthropy, where he's funding causes that are ostensibly aligned with what popular liberal opinion is in the United States, I always viewed that through the prism of an underlying understanding that he was kind of dressing up his baseline authoritarianism with this decoration of commitment to socially liberal causes. So like gun control, pro-choice, funding just Democratic congressional candidates, that kind of thing. That I always viewed with extreme suspicion because of what I knew about his tendencies on a more fundamental level, as best exemplified by his dead of night raid in 2011. And so now, after weeks of quote unquote speculation, which shouldn't have been speculation at all because he was officially running as of a couple weeks ago, in my view, today he puts out his, little tweet doing the bona fide announcement. And what happens? This is amazing. Bloomberg has an enormous media empire. So he's got enormous wealth, as people know. He's one of the richest people in the United States. He's in the top 10 richest people in the United States. I think he was number 8 last I checked, at a net worth of over $53 billion. And with that, he also commands an enormous media empire. Bloomberg. It's eponymous. It's named after him, Mike. And what did they announce today? They announced that, to preserve any or to combat any perception of conflict of interest, Bloomberg, the media empire, is going to not do any investigative journalism on any Democratic presidential candidate. They're still going to do it on Trump, of course. I don't know how that exactly makes sense, considering Trump would presumably be Mike Bloomberg's competitor if something insane happens and he were to actually get the Democratic nomination. But at least for this stage of the campaign, they are now saying that they are not going to do any investigative journalism on any Democratic candidate, including Mike. So that's, in a way, helpful to lots of Democratic candidates, because not that Bloomberg would necessarily produce some journalism that would take down like a Joe Biden or something, but they have one less adversarial media entity to worry about. And just them stating that they're not going to do anything investigative on any Democratic candidate shows you that there's now like a political bent, if it wasn't apparent already, which it should be, to now how the Bloomberg media organization is going to be operating, because it's a political decision to say we're not going to cover any Democratic candidate in a way that could actually unearth misconduct or corruption on the part of those candidates. And this is also hilarious. So today, when the campaign was formally announced, guess what also happened? They announced some initial hires for the campaign, and several top journalists from Bloomberg are joining the campaign, including the editor, the executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. And if you don't read Bloomberg Opinion, or you're not familiar with it, it's one of the most influential opinion sections in the country. Probably not on the level of a New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, but pretty close. And the editor of that section, the executive editor, David Shipley, is now working for the Mike Bloomberg 2020 presidential campaign. And not just Mr. Shipley, Tim O'Brien, who is also an executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and is one of their top columnists, who writes constantly about Trump, who wrote a book about Trump years ago and therefore was kind of elevated into this seniority status where he was this supreme authority on all things involving Trump and his tax returns. Some of what O'Brien did was actually useful journalistically. I'm not going to deny that. But Tim O'Brien, who is one of the guys who's constantly screaming about how press freedoms are under attack, and he's trying to police who's a real journalist and what journalistic freedoms are under threat in this very scary era of Trump. All of a sudden today, Tim O'Brien, he makes the very smooth and seamless transition from executive editor and columnist for Bloomberg Opinion to the Bloomberg 2020 presidential campaign. And I would love Tim O'Brien to square that with his past statements about how journalism is more important than ever and we have to protect it from the depredations of the Trump regime and so on and so forth. Now you're getting a direct paycheck from a guy who's one of the richest men in the entire world, who is now claiming he's going to spend, billions of dollars seeking the presidency. Again, he already did the biggest TV commercial and digital ad buy of all time, or at least the biggest TV commercial ad buy of all time for any political candidate. And we're a year out from the election. So imagine what he could spend in October of 2020. The previous biggest ad buy of all time for a 1 week time period was in October of 2012 when the Obama campaign bought it. Bloomberg is still getting the nomination or seeking the nomination, and he already has purchased the largest week-long series of TV advertisements ever. And so doesn't that have some pretty dicey implications for press freedom, for corporate power, for concentration of wealth, for all manner of other issues? And Tim Bryan is just like, you know what, I'm gonna go and work for Mike. I don't know what he's gonna do exactly, probably write things or whatever. Maybe dig into other candidates. Who knows what he's gonna do? But some intrepid journalist who is, I guess, formerly, as of today, a colleague of Tim O'Brien's, should maybe ask him to reflect on that discrepancy. And you got to kind of sit back and think, what does this signify on a deeper level? Because, we had Tom Steyer running for the presidency, who announced his campaign over the summer and has bought an enormous amount of ads concentrated in the 4 early states. And even if Tom Steyer is still vanishingly unlikely to win the nomination, he nonetheless succeeded in gaming the DNC's debate process. And he's been on now the last 2 debates because he was able to juice his numbers in particular Nevada, but also to some extent Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. And Steyer also bought a ton of Facebook ads to solicit $1 contributions, because you have to get a certain number of donations in order to qualify for the debate. So Tom Steyer already showed that a billionaire can basically manipulate these processes to his liking. But Mike Bloomberg, and of course you have Trump, who's possibly a billionaire. I mean, it's never 100% clear what his actual net worth is. Let's just say he's a billionaire. Trump, nonetheless, even though nonetheless built up a huge small donor base. I mean, a lot of people give Trump small donations. And Trump is now doing the typical Republican fundraising circuit where he goes before rich people and begs them for money. And they give it to the RNC or to his campaign apparatus, which are one and the same, essentially. Mike Bloomberg doesn't have to do any of that. His net worth is staggering. It's orders of magnitude beyond a Steyer or a Trump. It's something that we've never seen before. Really. $53 billion? You can't even conceive what that kind of wealth actually means. number 8 in the entire United States. So we can't really. I mean, my bias as somebody who just told you about how I have this visceral, almost loathing of Bloomberg, not just about the Occupy Wall Street raid. There was also his history with stop and frisk, which, even if you're somebody who wants to be tough on crime, even if you think that the government, by way of its police force, needs to take an extremely aggressive and active role in stopping street crime, was proven to be a gigantic failure, because when stop and frisks peaked in New York City under Bloomberg's reign, also happened to be 2011, the same year of the Occupy stuff and that raid, it reached almost 700,000 stop and frisks in New York City. And then from there, stop and frisk dropped off a cliff, meaning they almost abolished the practice. It was declared unconstitutional by a federal judge. And, fast forward into de Blasio's tenure. I have problems with de Blasio too, but at least de Blasio made good on his pledge to reform stop and frisk. And stop and frisk now is at the number of stop and frisk that take place in New York is infinitesimal compared to what it was at the height of Bloomberg. And yet, street crime, all the types of crimes that stop and frisk was supposed to be used to combat, the whole justification for stop and frisk was that we need to create public order. But it turns out that that crime continued to plummet to historic lows, irrespective of stop and frisk. Stop and frisk, if anything, created public disorder because it violated the civil liberties of innocent people, made them rightly suspicious of the police, made them less likely probably to even go to the police if they had genuine information about a crime, because they knew that the police were perfectly happy to victimize them on totally a groundless basis. So stop and frisk was one of the greatest violations of civil liberties that anybody has ever undertaken who's been in a position of municipal authority, given the size and influence of New York City. And so, that was one of the reasons that I have this kind of knee-jerk, I'm going to say knee-jerk, that I have this visceral disdain for Mike Bloomberg. But even if you don't share my visceral disdain in quite the same way, this idea that he's just going to parachute into the race, flood the entire country's TV airwaves with ads. I mean, it's something that's a little bit inconceivable, because he doesn't have to raise any money. He can buy this all himself if he really wants to. And he's probably going to draw a favorable distinction between his level of wealth and Trump's. And I don't know how impressed by that I should be. I'm not particularly impressed, but it is true in that it's orders of magnitude beyond Trump. So we have a situation where he doesn't have to have a small donor operation. He could just flip the money spigot on and do it all unilaterally. So we're now in this bizarre reality where Bloomberg really is not dependent on anybody to sustain himself financially other than himself. And that, to my knowledge, has never really happened before. You've had billionaires run, like Ross Perot was a billionaire, but this level of wealth is just transcends any of that. So, there's a way, if you could write a report on Bloomberg's presidential campaign as a foreign correspondent that sort of depicts the United States as this flailing oligarchy whose institutions are crumbling, just based on the fact of Bloomberg's presence now in the race and what he is planning to do to leverage his enormous wealth to basically insert himself into the national consciousness, and kind of dictate the contours of the race. Now, obviously, this is all complicated by a number of things, which is that, how could he run a viable presidential campaign and not compete at all in the 4 early states, which he's apparently not doing, seems entirely implausible. Um, However, again, even if you're somebody like me who has the visceral disdain and you think that his positions are well out of step with the median in the Democratic Party, and you think that there's no appetite for Bloomberg because, for the most part, people are generally content with the current composition of the Democratic primary field, you have to leave open the possibility that that level of expenditure, the experiment that Bloomberg is running in terms of what he can do with that wealth, might have an effect on the electorate that we just have never seen before, and therefore we can't really make any definitive statements about what its impact is going to be. So that's why Bloomberg has to be taken seriously here. You can't write him off as just an egotistical billionaire. That's what he is. But he's at the level of wealth and power that we have a precedent on a much smaller scale for somebody with that level of power being able to successfully manipulate political processes to his liking. So who knows what he can pull off. Bloomberg, as a Wall Street guy, as a guy who generated his wealth by creating these financial information networks that people who are traders use, he's extremely data oriented. So you got to think that there's somebody telling him something that's at least reasonably persuasive in terms of how he can deploy his resources to generate support. So, which is, to put it another way, you got to think that there's some logic that is data based in terms of why he's doing that maybe we, as ordinary lowly citizens, don't have access to. So the point is, you got to take Bloomberg seriously. Don't laugh it off. Don't just assume that it's a vanity project. It may well be. I agree basically with the pundit consensus that this doesn't make a whole lot of sense on the surface, but who knows what this guy is capable of. And so be on the lookout. All right. After I just saw the announcement, I wanted to go on a little bit of a rant. And unless anybody has a super chat query, then I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for joining in on this dark and rainy Sunday afternoon, which is kind of a fitting weather situation for the announcement of Bloomberg's presidential campaign. And I will speak to you later.